They say a man who builds his whole life on a lie always forgets one thing. The woman watching him do it has a memory like a steel trap. Naomi Whitlock used to believe forgiveness was a kind of strength. She believed it the way some people believe in luck or in church or in second chances. She had built her whole marriage on that belief, brick by brick, for 11 years. And she had told herself that loving someone meant absorbing their worst moments without keeping score. By the time she stopped believing it, the damage to her husband's life was already done, and he hadn't even noticed yet. It started on a Thursday in late October, in a kitchen in Mississauga that still smelled like the cinnamon candle she'd lit that morning out of habit, not joy. Naomi was 32, a senior project manager at a logistics firm downtown, and she had spent the day fielding emails about a shipment delay while her husband, Bryce Donnelly, spent the day doing whatever it was he did when he told her he was stuck at a site visit. Bryce ran his own contracting company, Donnelly Builds, and for the past year he had been stuck, more often than he was home. She found the receipt by accident, the way these things always seem to happen by accident, though later she would wonder if some part of her had been looking for it for months without admitting it to herself. It was tucked into the breast pocket of his good coat, the navy wool one he only wore to client dinners, a reservation confirmation from a boutique hotel on the lake, printed on cream cardstock like it was something to be proud of. 2 nights, a king suite. The name on the booking wasn't hers. Naomi didn't cry. She has thought about that a lot since. The strange calm that settled over her instead, like her body had decided. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford yet. She sat down at the kitchen table with the receipt in front of her and her tea going cold beside it, and she thought about her daughter, Piper, 6 years old and asleep upstairs with her stuffed rabbit, and she thought, not like this, not in front of her, not with screaming and broken plates and a custody battle that would make the kid choose sides before she even understood what a side was. So Naomi did what she had always done when something at work went sideways. She made a plan. She didn't confront him that night, or the next, or the one after that. She watched. She noticed the new gym membership he'd never mentioned, the cologne that wasn't the one she'd bought him for Christmas. The way he started taking his phone into the bathroom when he showered. She noticed that the company's books, which she had quietly helped manage for years, because Bryce was brilliant with a level and useless with a spreadsheet, had started showing withdrawals she didn't recognize. Client retainer fees, vanishing in chunks, routed through accounts she'd never seen before. She hired a man named Desmond Achibi. No, that wasn't right either, she corrected herself later, though by then it didn't matter what she called him in her head. She found a private investigator through a friend from her old college roommate. A quiet, methodical man, who worked out of a strip mall office above a dry cleaner, and didn't ask questions about why a woman wanted 3 weeks of surveillance on her own husband. By the second week, she had photographs. The woman was younger, 26, an interior designer named Bianca Soto, who Bryce had hired to redo the company's office last spring. Naomi remembered meeting her once at the holiday party, remembered thinking she seemed sweet. What Naomi found wasn't just an affair though, it was worse. In the way that only matters to someone who has spent a decade trusting another person with the architecture of her life. Bryce had been funneling company money into a second set of accounts, money that should have gone to subcontractors, to suppliers, to the crew of guys who had families of their own waiting on paychecks. He'd been using the business as a piggy bank to fund hotel rooms and a leased Audi he kept parked 2 streets over from their house, and a downtown condo he was paying for in cash so it wouldn't show up anywhere Naomi might think to look. She found all of it because she was the one who actually understood how the business worked. Bryce had never bothered to learn the back end himself. That was Naomi's job, the unpaid, unacknowledged labor of being the smart one in a marriage that required her to be smart quietly, behind the scenes, so he could be the one who got his name on the trucks. It took her 4 months to build the case. 4 months of smiling at dinner, of asking how his day was, of letting him kiss her cheek and not flinching. 4 months of meeting with a lawyer named Helena Forsyth in a glass office on Bay Street. A woman with silver-streaked hair and a way of looking at evidence like a surgeon looks at an X-ray. 4 months of quietly moving her own savings, the inheritance from her grandmother that she'd never put in a joint account because some instinct, even back then, had told her not to. And 4 months of building something else too. A plan to do what Bryce had never once done for her. Think 2 steps ahead. The breaking point, the one Bryce would never see coming, was their daughter's school fundraiser gala, held every November at a hotel ballroom downtown. The kind of event where contractors who wanted city contracts liked to be seen shaking hands. Bryce loved that gala. He loved it because it was the one night a year he got to play the version of himself he wished he actually was. generous, beloved, a pillar of the community standing next to his pretty wife and his pretty daughter. This year he brought Bianca, not on his arm, not technically. He was careful, telling Naomi that Bianca was attending as a vendor representative, since her design firm had donated the centerpieces. But Naomi watched the way his hand found the small of Bianca's back, when he thought no one was looking. The way he laughed too loud at things that weren't funny. Performing for an audience of one in a red dress standing too close to the silent auction table. Naomi had spent 4 months learning patience. She had learned it the way you learn anything that doesn't come naturally, by forcing it, over and over, until it started to feel almost like her own skin. She wore navy that night, not red, not anything that screamed for attention. She let Bryce introduce her to people as his wife. Watched him work the room. Watched him glad hand the city councilor, who controlled the permits for the waterfront development project Donnelly Builds had been chasing for a year. She let him have his whole evening, right up until the part where the school principal handed Bryce the microphone, to say a few words as that year's top corporate sponsor. Bryce loved a microphone, almost as much as he loved being looked at. He talked about community, about giving back, about how proud he was to support the next generation. He thanked his crew. He thanked the city. He did not thank Naomi, not really, just a glancing reference to my wife who keeps the home fires burning. The kind of line that made the women at her table exchange small, pitying glances. Then he handed the microphone back and Naomi stood up. She hadn't planned to do it that night, not exactly. Not in front of 300 people and a 6-year-old asleep at the babysitter's. But Helena had warned her, weeks earlier, that there would come a moment when the timing chose itself, and she should trust it when it came. Standing there in her navy dress, watching her husband bask in applause he hadn't earned with money that wasn't fully his, Naomi understood that this was the moment. She didn't raise her voice. That was the thing people talked about afterward, the thing that made it into a dozen retellings over coffee in the weeks that followed. That Naomi Whitlock had never once raised her voice. "Before we move on to dessert," she said, taking the microphone from the table where Bryce had set it down, "I think it's only fair the room knows exactly how generous my husband has really been this year." She had a folder, a simple manila folder, the kind anyone might carry, and inside it were printed bank statements, the trail of withdrawals, from Donnelly Builds' operating account, routed to a numbered account that funded a condo on King Street and 2 nights at a lake house under a name that wasn't his wife's. She didn't read every line, she didn't have to, she read enough. The dollar amounts, the dates, the matching dates on hotel confirmations. And she watched 300 faces shift from confusion to recognition to the particular, electric silence of people realizing they were watching something they would talk about for years. Bryce's face went the color of old paper. He reached for the microphone, said her name like a warning, but 2 men near the door. Men Naomi had quietly arranged through Helena's office. Off-duty contractors who were owed money themselves and had been more than willing to be present, stepped forward to make sure he understood. The room had questions he couldn't outrun. The city councilor stood up first, then the man from the bank that held Donnelly Builds' line of credit, then, devastatingly, 3 of Bryce's own subcontractors, men who had been quietly owed money for months and who recognized their own unpaid invoices in the numbers Naomi was reading. Bianca tried to leave. She made it as far as the coat check before someone. Naomi never confirmed who, though she suspected Helena had a hand in it, pointed out that her design firm's donation receipts for the centerpieces had been billed at triple the market rate, paid for out of the same compromised account, which made her, whether she liked it or not, a witness the room very much wanted to keep around. What Bryce hadn't understood, what he had never once stopped to consider in 11 years of marriage, was that Naomi wasn't only his wife. She had quietly become, over the past 2 years, the majority shareholder in Donnelly Builds itself. It had happened slowly, unglamorously. Her grandmother's inheritance, invested at a moment when the business needed a cash injection, and Bryce, too proud to ask his father for help, had let his wife lend the company money in exchange for equity he assumed would never matter. He'd signed the paperwork without reading it carefully, the way he signed most things, because he trusted that nothing his wife did would ever be used against him. "I'm not interested in destroying the company," Naomi said, into the microphone, her voice level, almost gentle. 41 families depend on Donnelly Builds for their income, and none of them deserve to lose their jobs because of what their boss did with money that wasn't his to spend. As of this morning, I've filed the paperwork to formally take over as majority owner and CEO. Bryce will, of course, remain welcome to apply for a position as a foreman. The laughter that rippled through the room wasn't cruel, not exactly, but it wasn't kind either. It was the laughter of people who had spent a long time pretending not to notice things, finally given permission to react. Bryce did not take it well. He grabbed for the folder, knocked over a centerpiece, one of Bianca's overpriced arrangements, and shouted something about lawyers, about how Naomi couldn't just do this, about how it was his name on the building. One of the off-duty men near the door reminded him, quietly but firmly, that escalating in a room full of city officials, and a reporter from the local business paper who happened to be covering the gala, was probably not his best move. It got worse before it got better, the way these things always do. Bryce tried, in the weeks afterward, to fight her in court, hiring a lawyer who took one look at the post-nuptial agreement Naomi had quietly drawn up 18 months earlier, buried among a stack of refinancing documents he'd signed without reading, the way he signed everything, and told him, bluntly, that he didn't have a case worth pursuing. The agreement protected Naomi's inheritance, her equity stake, and made clear that any funds misappropriated from the company would be considered grounds for full forfeiture of his ownership claim. He lost the house, which had been purchased with a down payment from her grandmother's money, and was therefore never fully his to lose. He lost the leased Audi when the dealership, unable to verify continued payment from a now frozen account, repossessed it from the driveway one rainy Tuesday morning, while neighbors watched from behind their curtains. He lost Bianca within 3 weeks, once it became clear there was no money left to fund the version of himself she'd been attracted to in the first place. And he lost, perhaps most painfully, the thing he'd built his entire identity around, his name on the side of the trucks, which Naomi, with a practicality that surprised even her own lawyer, chose not to change. Donnelly Builds stayed Donnelly Builds. It was easier for the 41 employees, she said. It was also, though she never said this part out loud, a small daily reminder to anyone who asked that the man whose name was on the building no longer owned a single brick of it. The custody arrangement that followed was civil, almost disappointingly so. Bryce got every other weekend with Piper, supervised at first, until he proved he could show up sober and on time, which took longer than anyone expected. Naomi never spoke badly about him to their daughter. She didn't need to. Piper was 6, not stupid, and children notice more than adults like to believe. A year later, Donnelly Builds had its best quarter in company history. Partly because Naomi finally fixed the bidding process. Bryce had always managed by instinct and bravado instead of math. And partly because word travels fast in the contracting world about which companies actually pay their subcontractors on time. She hired a new operations manager, a quiet, steady man named Foster Whitman, who had been one of the subcontractors stiffed by Bryce, and who had stood up that night at the gala without hesitation. He was nothing like Bryce. He didn't need a microphone to feel important, and he never once forgot to ask how her day had gone. Naomi still lived in Mississauga, though in a different house now, one she'd bought herself with Mussy, that had never belonged to anyone but her. Piper had a new bedroom painted the pale green she'd picked out herself, and a school photo on the fridge where she was missing both front teeth and grinning like the world hadn't given her a single reason not to. Sometimes, late at night after Piper was asleep, Naomi would think back to that kitchen table in October, the cold tea, the receipt with someone else's name on it. She didn't feel triumphant, exactly. She felt, more than anything, like someone who had finally stopped holding her breath. A man who spends his whole life believing his wife is too soft to ruin him will never see it coming when she decides, quietly, calmly, without raising her voice once. That softness was never the same thing as weakness at all.